Hi everybody, welcome back to Grow Great Live. I'm Ria Lala and I've got Antonia Dodge and Mariana Pollock with me, and hopefully you caught our last segment, which was 1 hour devoted to children, who's in charge. Well, today we've got something down and dirty, and we're talking about a subsection of that, which is boundaries, and how do we create good boundaries with our kids. So Mariana, Antonia, you tell me, how do you create really strong boundaries with kids?
Well, it's tough because you have to balance their current level of development with, what can you reasonably expect from your kids, acknowledging that they're children, but by the same token, make sure that they're not violating something that you wouldn't let anybody do, right? And that's actually the litmus test for me. Is if my kids, and I've got 2 stepsons and a daughter, if any of them are talking to me in a way that I wouldn't let anybody talk to me, that's a boundary, right? If my child shows up and she just said shut up to me for the first time yesterday, which was surprising and very disconcerting. Well, I don't let anybody tell me to shut up, right? Like that's just a boundary I have as a person. So even though I have to acknowledge that she's at a different level of development, she's trying new things out, she's trying to figure out the world, and she's trying things on for size. What happens when I tell mom to shut up? She's just trying to figure that out. I have to balance her level of development and trying things out with a boundary I have as a human being. I won't let anybody tell me to shut up. If they tell me to shut up, I'm going to immediately okay, time out. All right, let's address why you believe that you can speak to me in that fashion. Let's address why you think that you can be that aggressive. So oftentimes the first level of boundary that I create is, would I let anybody else talk to me this way? And if the answer is no, I'm certainly not going to allow a child to do so, my child or anybody else's child. So that's the first level of boundary that I've chosen to create. And then, of course, when that boundary has been offended, now I have to engage with the child. Now I have to explain to them why that's not going to be working out that way, why the dynamic is not set up that way, and make sure that they understand that they're the child and I'm the parent.
Yes, love that, love that. And when it comes to boundaries and rules as well, I'm a mother of 2 boys, and they're very individual and not as much rambunctious, but very free-spirited, and they don't do well with a lot of boundaries and a lot of structure. So I've tried to mitigate that by saying, look, there are some boundaries and some rules that absolutely have to be followed, for which there is a consequence really, really great. Something along the lines of if you don't stop on the red light, which is the rule you have to follow, and there's a boundary, you will get killed or kill somebody. And on the other hand, there's some boundaries that you could work around as long as it's for the greater good and for the growth and development. One of the things that I've seen even before I was a mom, and I see some of it today as well. I see a lot of and usually littler kids, like toddlers, hitting their moms if they don't get their way, which in my mind is a huge no-no. Do we sometimes express ourselves in different ways? Yes. Do kids kick each other and hit each other? Yes, they do. It's never okay, but regardless of that, it happens. To me, hitting your parent, and especially your mother, and especially if the child is a boy, it's totally unacceptable. And both my boys actually tried that with me when they were little, in which point it was I really took some time to explain to them with full presence that hitting your parent, it's never going to be okay, and it's never acceptable. And from then on, they never tried it. And I think it's also a stepping stone to show respect, not just in a physical manner, but it's also in an emotional and mental manner towards grown-ups, because we see a lot of that disrespect of younger generations to the older generations. And I think that physical violence also, it's a huge part of that.
Yeah, no, good stuff. I have a slightly different slant on boundaries. I think that there's something that all of us as parents can do that would be very useful when we're even thinking about our boundaries. So, and that happens long before, that happens once the child has pushed up against one of our boundaries. So for example, if our child swears, if our child says the F word to us, or that says I hate you, or they throw something at a wall, like let's think about all the different things that could happen where we have to now create a boundary. If in that moment we get unstuck from this is wrong. There's a right way and there's a wrong way of behaving. If for that moment we go into curious detective mode, where we look at every action that our child has as there's some sort of, in their 5-year-old, 3-year-old, 10-year-old mind, there was some rationale that made sense for them. Maybe it was an emotional regulation. Maybe it's not a suboptimal behavior that they're exhibiting, but it made sense for them to communicate in this way. So if we take that mindset when we have our children, then all of a sudden when they've met with our boundary and we feel that resistance and we're like, how dare you? Why would you do that? And we need to feel to adamantly set our boundary, where we go into a questioning, curious, wondering, and for one moment in time, pretend that there was a complete reason and justification for it. Because once we have that mindset, our mind becomes hospitable to the questioning, the asking, the engagement to extract information from the kid to find why they chose to do that. But if we go into, that's my boundary and you've just trespassed on my boundary and that is like a no-no, then all of a sudden you can just feel energetically what that feels like. There's a resistance and the child feels the resistance. So now if we go into, I'm just curious, like why, I can see that you're really angry right now. I can see that you must be really frustrated for you to say that you hate me. And so before I get into any blame or shame, I want to understand what made you get so angry. Tell me about that. And in that moment, the child now has discourse. They're able to communicate why, what was painful for them, what felt like such an assault to them for them to say, I hate you. But if we get too stuck in our boundaries where we go, absolutely not, don't you ever say I hate you, that is just unsuitable. And then we discipline or we do whatever we do, there's no communication. So to me, I always take the mindset there's always a reason that my children have behaved a particular way. It may not be what I want. It may be suboptimal. I may need to teach them some more tools. But for me to stay in dialogue where they're in rapport with me, I need to make sure that I keep that communication open. So that's what I would recommend initially before we set hard and fast boundaries.
Well, and then that means that there's like two levels. There's the creation of the boundary itself by the parent, and then there's what do you do when it gets rubbed up against. And I mean, what you're talking about is how you deal with it. That doesn't mean that the boundary isn't there. And as a human being, I think you're allowed to establish boundaries just in general. I think boundary creation with relationships is actually healthy, recognizing what you will and will not allow to happen with you. How you deal with it, though, doesn't have to be, like you said, a blame game. It doesn't have to be shame or blame. It can be, okay, so you just rubbed up against a boundary. Let's talk about why. Let's talk about what happened there. So mom is not okay with this. However, that doesn't mean that you're now evil, wrong, need to be punished. Now it's like, let's talk about why humans create boundaries. Let's talk about why it's healthy to have a boundary. Let's talk about why you rubbed up against this one, what was going on for you. And then, like you said, make it a discourse and dialogue.
Exactly. But even that first part on trying to understand what our boundaries are, that isn't an easy question to answer.
No, it's not.
No.
You need to do some work to figure out
Yes.
what are those things that actually feel like this isn't in resonance with who I am or how I think or how I want to live.
Right.
And so I'd love to hear from you guys. How do you recommend parents go from, I don't really know, I'm kind of wishy-washy, I'm not really sure if that's a boundary, to, yeah, I feel solid that this is my boundary. What do you recommend?
For some people would be, I would imagine, where do I come from? What is my upbringing? What is my culture? What was generationally done in my family? How do I feel about it? What do I think will be best for my children as well? Kind of drawing from the traditional upbringing of them and the generations before them. For others, it will be more future-oriented, and more different kind of ways of creating boundaries. So what is it that I want out of this? How is that hurting me? What's my value that I uphold to? What are my needs? And then what are the needs of my children? How do I see this family working? How do I see myself as a mother, not just now, but 15, 16 years from now? Because, a lot of it, what we do when they're little shows up later in teenage years. My son is, going into the teenage years, and now I see kind of where everything that we've done with ourselves and with them, it's showing up, both positive and some of the negatives as well. So I think that it has to do a lot with, you kind of put yourself in the middle and see, where do you want to draw from? Do you want to draw from the past and traditional and generational, or, you want to kind of see how do you see yourself in the future with your children, and how do you see your children as well, and then kind of go from there.
Yeah, I agree. I think different personality types are going to have a different foundation for how they set their personal boundaries. There's nothing wrong with questioning what where your boundary came from, though, regardless of where you're calling that data from, or regardless of where you've decided, like, well, my mom would never have allowed this, so I'm not going to allow it in my child. Regardless of where you're determining that source is, there's never a problem in the, not even just in the moment. Of course, the moment gives you an opportunity to think about it, or to tag that this is something I want to be thinking about later. But there's never a problem with asking yourself if this particular boundary, that it's actually not yours, right? Like, it came from somewhere else. Like, somebody else insinuated that this was not appropriate. And what I think, even asking yourself that dialogue, even having the dialogue of, why do I have that boundary? Is this an authentic boundary to me? Opens up what Ria was talking about, which is, am I on autopilot through the entire process? Like, my parents wouldn't have allowed this, so this is what they did for me. They yelled at me, right? They said, that is not acceptable. If you're on autopilot with where the boundary is created, you're probably going to be on autopilot with how you deal with the boundary, or the boundary violation. So just being open to questioning the whole process means you're not going to be on autopilot. And just that alone not being on autopilot is going to expand your ability to create more intimacy with your kid.
Extremely important. And I love the questions that are being asked. The one thing that I would also add to that, though, is to allow for a component of that, and a very crucial component, not to be so cognitive. So how do we get to the point when we're thinking about, well, asking ourselves questions and thinking about what's valuable to us, and doing that inner dialogue, which is all very cerebral, but at the end we're still tied, because we want to service our like our parents, about pay homage to how they raised us, and we want to think about, oh, well, culturally this is what we're doing, and then we feel torn. So then here we are sitting as a frazzled parent, going, this is what I kind of feel, but my mother did this, and my culture says this, and I don't know, and this is what I want for the future, and they're still in a ball of, what do I do? And so getting out of our head as much. And when we talked about in the last episode, the Big Long Hours episode, we talked about, leaning back and just being still and intuiting, and actually trusting that knowledge, that feeling of a boundary that I want to set, that feels new and organic and relevant to me right now in this day, in this moment, that comes from somebody who is not just staying in their head. They're getting into their body and they're feeling it. And that requires us to be still. Be still for long lengths of time, and look for those moments where you're still and not doing, just being. And in those moments, see what occurs to you, see what you are drawn towards, because something will open up. Something will go, oh, I feel myself pull towards this. I kind of like that. And it's hard. It's hard because you have the world coming in at you and all the past history of every generation. But if you can just be still long enough to hear the calling, just like when our kids are bored, and instead of using a gadget, you say, let the call of boredom open something up for them, and they all of a sudden go and build a time machine, or they do something cool. Let that just rise up, and there will be something.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And one other thing is that a lot of people set boundaries out of spite. Well, my mother did this to me, I will never allow my children to do this. Or my mother did this to me, then therefore I'm going to do something totally opposite with my children. For instance, I was a picky eater when I was younger, and my mom had a rule that I will never get off the table until I finish everything. And that turned into a screaming, crying match, me thinking that I'm adopted, they don't love me, the whole spiel.
Right.
And I said to myself, when I do have children, I will never do this to them, no matter how picky of an eater they were. So I was blessed with a picky eater. Of course. So when I realized that, it just hit me all of a sudden. So I remember what I said back in the day when I was 10. And I saw him right in front of me, being 4 and not wanting to eat, the vegetables or whatever when it was in front of him. And I said to myself, I can go and do everything as spite, let him eat snacks or whatever, he wants, or I can just create something that will help him be nourished, and at the same time not feel like he is, he has to do it. And that was the way that, we set it up, where he needs to try everything at least once and then tell us the opinion. And I'll try to make it some in a different way next time. And we actually have a really good conversation around that, where he doesn't feel threatened, that, he's supposed to eat. And then I'll also, why I explained to him the importance of nutrition and just how important it is for his muscles and for his soccer game and in his brain and everything. So that was a really good wake-up call for me to never make promises to myself that, I can't fulfill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So what's one really good takeaway? What's one really good how-to that you would recommend that parents do when they're trying to either establish boundaries or implement like a handling of it when they have a boundary violation?
Probably the biggest one is when you are hit at a point where, as I mentioned before, hit at a point where something is happening, you're experiencing something where you feel a boundary should be set. They're up against something, you are pushing up against something that feels uncomfortable for you. Mm-hmm. If you haven't done the work to even figure out what your boundaries are, that's a separate matter. But definitely be curious, be like a curious detective trying to understand, and leave some allowance for there is a reason and a rationale that's perfectly logical for why this is happening. Mm-hmm. Because more than anything, what I want is for parents not to feel, not to create hard and fast rules, for the kids to now see that as unjust and then feel angry and then separate from you. Mm-hmm. Because nobody wins based on that boundary. Mm-hmm. So I would say that to me is the biggest thing, is to figure out how you can be curious whenever something happens that you don't like. Mm-hmm. Curious and investigative, and ask questions, and come, as I mentioned before, always lead with the right emotionally, and then only after use logic. So just wondering why they might have done something. That's mm-hmm. the biggest tip that I would give.
Mm-hmm. And go ahead, Mariana.
Well, just, tailing on that, the part of the curiosity is asking yourself a question, what am I settling for? What would I settle for? And maybe like, how far can my child go in telling me something or doing something that will still give me some room to wiggle when I'm saying, oh, okay, so the boundary is about to be broken. I need to intervene so that we don't have to go into the reactionary mode of like fixing something after the boundary is broken. So kind of like just say, okay, so what will I settle? Well, they can tell me that, they hate me, but they can absolutely hit me. Or they can, like hit me, but never ever say that I'm a bad mother. So that's the curiosity. They're just the inquiry on, what's the line that should not be crossed. And everybody has their own line.
Yeah, and I'm all about the beginning of the process will impact the end of it. So I would say be clear about your boundaries to yourself and ask why. Mm-hmm. Are they outsourced? Are you adopting boundaries from other people? Is this something that you haven't thought about? Are you still on autopilot? And one of the things you can do is literally write down a list. Literally write down a list of the behavior that you've seen from other kids, or maybe behavior you did, or behavior your children is doing, and ask yourself, like, truly, is this a personal boundary? Is this something that, as Ria was talking about, viscerally comes up for you? Like, are you feeling this thing in your body? Is it something that truly is important to you, or it's something that's actually not that important? You just believe that to be a good mom or to be a good dad, this is supposed to be a boundary. So also be a curious detective with yourself, and start from that place of what are my actual boundaries, and then when maybe a boundary has been violated, continue to go in that curious detective mode as opposed to being reactionary and trying to stamp it down.
Great stuff. All right, everyone. Hopefully you have some really good tips in your pocket, and we look forward to sharing some more with you really soon. That's all from Grow Great Live.